Let us begin by land acknowledgement. In the spirit and intent of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's recommendations, we acknowledge the traditional indigenous territories on which we gather at the beginning of all Masco meetings. We would like to begin by acknowledging that the land on which we gather is the traditional territory of the Wendat, the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, Métis, and the Mississaugas of the Scugog, Hiawatha, and Alderville First Nation. By learning, understanding, and acknowledging, we wish to pay respect to Turtle Island, Mother Earth, and to the rich Indigenous history of Ontario. I also take this opportunity to welcome Mr. Georgie John, who is the president of Masco, and he works as a child welfare supervisor with Toronto Children's Aid Society. He is here to say a few words about today's section and to welcome you all. Over to you, Georgie.
Good morning, everyone. So just to briefly tell you all about MASO. MASO is a Malayali Association of Social Workers in Ontario. It's an association of immigrant professional social workers from the province of Kerala, India. Currently, we have 350 members in our fraternity, which is spread across Ontario. MASO has been implementing several initiatives for the professional development of our members and our community in general. Today, MASO is hosting a conversation on diversity, equity, and inclusion from a South Asian perspective. Dr. Vidya Shah will lead this conversation. Apart from discussing the fundamentals of diversity, equity, and inclusion, this conversation will explore the learning and unlearning required for strengthening solidarity among racialized and marginalized groups to collectively dismantle white supremacy and oppressive practices prevailing in our institutions. The conversation will examine the ways in which brown identities and experiences are made invisible in North American society and discuss ideas to make our identities more visible in relation to the other racialized groups in our institutions. On behalf of MASO executive team, I would like to extend a warm welcome to each one of you. Friends, this conversation may make us uncomfortable, but surely provoke and challenge our thinking, ignite and elevate our minds, and enrich in reshaping the way we see the realities around us. Let us use this as an opportunity to learn and unravel our biases and prejudice to become better warriors of justice, individually and collectively. Mr. Siju Simon is the moderator for this session today. He's currently working as a supervisor for the York Children's Aid Society. He has extensive experience in the field of child protection. Siju completed his master's degree in social work from India. He worked as a social worker in India for a few years with different organizations. Siju moved to Scotland in 2004 and started his career in child protection. Siju immigrated to Canada in 2011 and started his career in child protection as a casework supervisor with the government of Nova Scotia. Siju moved to Kingston CS in 2011 as a team manager, and in 2015, he joined Lanark, Leeds, and Grenville CAs as service manager. Siju has numerous years of social work experience, including working with a diverse population and in various countries. Siju is an active community mobilizer and serves as the president of Kingston Malayali Association as well. Over to you, Siju.
Thank you, Georgie. I'm really happy to be present today. And once again, MASO has come up with another interesting and very timely topic. So diversity, equity, and inclusion is probably one of the most frequently discussed topics in social sector, especially after the murder of Mr. George Floyd in 2020. Therefore, it was a timely decision for MASO to organize a session on this topic for its members. So I thank MASO executive team for this timely session and inviting me to moderate this session. Why are diversity, equity, and inclusion important? And the simple answer is diversity, equity, and inclusion matter because They help build a fair society that allows all the people to get equal opportunities. DEI brings together people, perspectives, and ideas to help create stronger bonds among individuals and strengthen organizations. Over the last few years, organizations, both in the public and private sector, have taken genuine efforts in implementing DEI principles in their practice. For those of us working in the social sector, especially in the child welfare sector, training on DEI is now a mandatory thing, and many organizations now have a separate DEI department, and many have created separate DEI specialist positions within their organization. Despite all this, diversity, equity, and inclusion still remain as a topic that is easier to write and talk about than to achieve. Organizations still struggle in implementing these principles, implementing the principles of DEI in its entirety. For many, it's not an easy topic to talk about, especially often in a work environment. I hope sessions like this will make us, make equity-seeking communities like us confident and comfortable in initiating hard conversations in our respective workplaces without the fear of offending. And Dr. Vidya Shah is going to lead our conversation today. Dr. Vidya Shah is an educator, scholar, and activist committed to equity and racial justice in the service of liberatory education. She is an assistant professor in the Faculty of Education at York University, and her research explores anti-racist, decolonizing approaches to leadership in schools, communities, and school districts. She also explores educational barriers to the success and well-being of Black, Indigenous, and racialized students. Dr. Shah teaches in the Masters of Leadership and Community Engagement program, as well as undergraduate and graduate level courses in education. She has worked in the Model Schools for Inner Cities program in the Toronto's District School Board, and was an elementary classroom teacher in the Toronto District School Board prior to joining York University. This will be one and a half hour session, and towards the end of the sessions, there will be an opportunity to ask questions for about 15 minutes. So please use your chat function on your Zoom app to post your questions. Once again, I welcome all of you to the sessions on DEI. Over to you, Dr. Shah.
Thank you so much. Thank you for that welcome, and thank you to Maswell for the amazing work that you are doing in your organizations, and to all of you as individual social workers that are just doing tremendous work for young people, for families across Ontario and beyond. And so thank you everyone for being here on this Saturday morning to spend some time together and to delve into some topics together. I'll just, before I sort of share screen with my PowerPoint, I do want to just share that, you know, today's conversation is really, it came out of, you know, Joji shared with the murder of George Floyd in 2020. There was a group of us that came together and said, you know, we have to start thinking about our role and our place as South Asians, as folks that identify perhaps as brown here in North America, to think about what is our responsibility and our relationship to that issue, so that it's not this separate event that happened that is disconnected from us and that's disconnected from a larger history, but really thinking about how are we implicated in that murder? How are we implicated in the ways in which we think about Black families, Black children, Black colleagues, and what does that mean about how we can be and act and live and lead differently as we move through this? So I share with you today in part as a South Asian woman here in Toronto, Ontario, Canada. I share with you in part as somebody who's continuing to learn and think about these issues. Far from, I don't think anyone has figured this out or knows the answer to really anything, but I'm sharing with you a process of learning that many of us have been in for the past 2 years, thinking about this issue very deeply. But I also share my experiences with you as, as Vidya was sharing, as a former classroom teacher. And so much of the work that I have done with young people, many of whom you have interacted with as well, has been an opportunity to think about, what does this look like in action? What does this look like on the ground? And so today's conversation will be sort of moving in and out of a little bit of theory and a little bit of practice. So I'm going to share screen here. And again, today's conversation towards Brown-Black solidarities, thinking about how can we think about the relationship between Brown or South Asian communities and Black communities. And I'll speak more to this notion of Brown in just a moment. And I want to really thank the earlier for the land acknowledgement. And I'll just go here again and share a little bit as well. I think it's never lost upon us to acknowledge the lands multiple times. So I encourage you, wherever you are in this virtual space, to acknowledge the lands on which you are currently situated. And in fact, I also invite you to use the chat function. And if you know the lands upon which you are situated and the Indigenous communities that have been on that land, whether on Turtle Island or elsewhere, please do go ahead and type that in the chat. I'm calling in from Toronto, Ontario, Canada, and I'd like to acknowledge my presence and perhaps our presence on the traditional territory of many Indigenous nations who have lived on this land for thousands of years, since time immemorial. Takaranto has been caretaken by the Anishinaabeg Nation, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, the Huron-Wendat, and the Métis Nation, and it is now home to many Indigenous peoples. As treaty people, people that are in relation through agreements of caring and sharing for these lands, I'd like to acknowledge the current treaty holders, the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation, and acknowledge that this territory is the subject of the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, which was an agreement to peaceably share and care for the Great Lakes regions. I'd also like to acknowledge and pay respect to the histories of Indigenous resistance to colonization and white supremacy, and to ongoing acts of resistance and resurgence of Indigenous ways of knowing and life through scholarship, through art, through poetry, through social movements, through industry, through medicine, through spirituality, and more. And it's important for those of us that do not identify as Indigenous from these lands that we acknowledge our place here as visitors. And while some of us have arrived on these lands by choice as immigrants, or some have arrived seeking asylum from unsafe homes, and while some of us have arrived here through forced displacement via various political actions, such as through the transatlantic slave trade, we are all here on lands that are home to Indigenous peoples since time immemorial. And part of what that means is that we need to grapple with the ways in which we continue to benefit by being on these lands from the ongoing displacement, cultural genocide, and forced assimilation of Indigenous peoples. I invite you as well to think about the ways in which our relationship to Indigenous peoples back home, wherever back home might be, what your relationship is to Indigenous people there. Because it sets the tone for how we engage with our relations with Indigenous people here. How do we relate to Indigenous people back home? And when I say Indigenous, I mean especially communities that have been there for a long time, that have been with the influx of, British colonization and all sorts of various forms of colonization in various parts of South Asia, how do we relate to the first peoples of our lands? Are there conceptions of being backwards or being uncivilized or not being modern? Or how are we thinking about in what ways have knowledges and languages been decimated? And what is our relationship to that? In what ways are we trying to support a revival of ways of knowing that have really been erased? And that sets the tone for how we think about today. And that sets the tone for how we think about where we are right now. And I also just want to take a moment to acknowledge that as a settler on these lands, I'm very grateful for the opportunity to meet here. And I'm increasingly aware of my responsibilities. I think about the fact that there continues to be gross indignities and inhumane acts of oppression. I think about the missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls, and two-spirited folks across Canada, that there's a national inquisition to find out why these missing, murdered women and girls have gone missing and are murdered, and why there is no record of who these children are, who these women are, who these people are. I think about the environmental degradation of sacred waters and land due to resource development policies or pipelines. I think about the need for major public investment in Indigenous education and healthcare and social services and water infrastructure and housing to provide even the basic access to rights and well-being. And as I say this, I'm also thinking about the millions of people in India and elsewhere who are also fighting for these basic human rights. Indigenous people Indigenous to India and to that land, and not just India, but all of South Asia. I think about state-sanctioned violence and murder against Indigenous people, a shameful history of residential schooling here on these lands, and the impact that the Indian Act has and continues to have on Indigenous people and more. And specific to the context of social work, I think about the negotiation of parties, including the Assembly of First Nations, Chiefs of Ontario, and lawyers who won two class action lawsuits. And the Crown Indigenous Relations Minister, Mark Miller, in Ottawa, announced a $40 billion Indigenous child welfare settlement, which is the largest in Canadian history. And I share this background because we can't talk about the experiences of solidarities and the experiences of building relationships without understanding the histories upon which and the present conditions upon which we are living in. And so there's another moment that I want to name. And as we've seen since the murders of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor in the US, and many of Black brothers and sisters here in Canada, this is not something that happens in the US alone. There are many names that I could call, Ahmaud Arbery, so many names that I can call here in the Canadian context. But I'd like to acknowledge the current moment that we're in that has seen this upsurge in awareness of how whiteness and how white supremacy continues to construct anti-Blackness and perpetuate anti-Black racism in the political sphere, in the economic sphere, socially, mentally, emotionally, psychically. And we're seeing the simultaneous commitment to stand in solidarity with Black life. And many of these commitments we know are performative, public statements or public tweets, and they don't actually address the systems, the structures, the policies, the institutions, the ideologies that give rise to the fact that the state, it's state-sanctioned violence, that the state has sanctioned the violence and murder of Black people and Indigenous people by the police. I think about the disproportionate number of Black and Indigenous children in care. I think about racist detention and deportation policies towards Black migrants, grave inequities in housing, social services, justice, immigration, and healthcare towards Black people, and more. As author of the book Policing Black Lives shares, her name is Robin Maynard, she shares that these inequities that we're seeing today are simply contemporary manifestations of the large-scale exploitation of Black lives and labor under the transatlantic slave trade that was abolished in Canada in 1834. And most people think that enslavement of African diasporic people is something that happened in the US, but it happened in Canada. And it was abolished in Canada in 1834. And also racially segregated schools that existed in Canada, the last of which closed in 1983. That's less than 40 years ago. So while there's this growing awareness of anti-Black racism, we've seen only minimal calls to action that disrupts the presence of white supremacy and anti-Blackness, and instead speaks of anti-Black racism as historical, as in the time of slavery, not of this land that some call Canada, drawing comparisons to our neighbors down south, or not of this particular organization or institution, in this case, child welfare. But of course, all of this begs the question, what do we need to dismantle, to undo, to unlearn, to unlead in order to create anew? And how can we engage in the creative destruction of policies and structures that for far too long have disadvantaged particular populations of students? And I share this introduction by way of naming that these are important elements of the larger socio-political contexts in which we speak about brownness or South Asianness, brown realities, and brown and Black solidarities. So as we move today in our time together, we're going to spend some time centering our collective experiences, thinking about how we come to this issue, how we relate to this issue. We're also going to spend some time thinking about some definitions and concepts. We're going to trouble this idea of the model minority. We're going to theorize or think about what brown complicity might mean in the context of white supremacy. And then we're going to look to brown-Black solidarities. What does this mean? And in our end, I'd love to sort of think with you about the implications for young people, for families, for staff that are doing this work. I'm just going to invite you to take a moment to think about this. You know, when we have people here from various parts of Ontario and beyond, and I'm just going to ask you to take a moment to think about what are your experiences with Brown or South Asian and Black relations. What have your experiences been? What questions do you have? What worries do you have? And maybe we'll just take a moment. We'll give you some time to reflect on this, a minute or so, and feel free to write in the chat if something comes up for you that you think you'd like to share via the chat. And these could be experiences that are difficult experiences. These could be experiences that feel very liberatory. These could be experiences that are questions for you. So feel free to write in the chat a question or an example or a statement. And just seeing your comment, Simon, thank you. Mm-hmm. Thank you, Alan. So Marina, thank you for sharing the need to acknowledge that racism against Brown people also exists, and that as a Brown person, you have felt intimidated even wanting to know about Black culture. Thank you for sharing that, Marina. And Charles, thank you for sharing a lot of inhibitions and prejudices existing in our communities against Black people. And notice the juxtaposition of both of those comments, that it's possible for both of them to be true. And how do we make sense of that? So folks, as ideas come to you, please feel free to continue sharing. Really appreciate Alan and Marina and Charles for sharing. And yes, Alan, thank you so much for writing that. Folks, I really do want this to be a session that speaks to you, that addresses some of your questions and concerns, and that we hear from your wisdom and your experiences in thinking about this collectively. This is something that we all need to be engaged in collectively, and that we all have experience with. And all of those experiences matter. So please feel free to use the chat to share those experiences and what that means. Yeah, the invisibilizing of our experiences in public discourses. It's a big one. That's a big one. So again, feel free to continue using the chat as I go on, and we'll come back to those comments. Just as we think about moving into this space, I think it's really important that we sort of have some sort of collective understanding. And while I don't like to use any one definition for anything, because I think many definitions come to us in different ways, I think it's important for us to have a landing place where we can sort of come together. So I love this quote by Frances Lee Ansley, and she says that by white supremacy, I don't mean to allude to only the self-conscious racism of white supremacist hate groups. I'm thinking about Ottawa, the convoy in Ottawa a couple of months ago. I refer instead to a political, economic, and cultural system in which whites overwhelmingly control power and material resources. Conscious and unconscious ideas of white superiority and entitlement are widespread, and the relations of white dominance and non-white subordination are daily reenacted. So this power existence is reenacted daily across a broad array of institutions and social settings. So you'll see here that this definition really helps us to broaden the understandings that white supremacy is a political, economic, cultural system. It's built into our institutions. It's built into structures and policies and practices. That is different from a white supremacist, who is a person that upholds white supremacy, right? And so our focus, when we can turn the focus away from individuals, although those individuals need to be held to account, absolutely, but when we can turn our attention to the systems and structures that allow, for example, when we think about the Buffalo shooting the other day, and we think about the ways in which police respond to that kind of violence, whether it's deemed a hate crime, how the police interact with a white shooter, and so many people saying that they know that if the shooter was Black, that he would be taken down by the cops right away and possibly murdered. And so thinking about the ways in which the state itself allows certain kinds of violences, enables certain kinds of violences, and shuts down any other form of, not that any violence should be allowed, but the ways in which we think about and respond to different people doing the exact same thing speaks to a built-in system that allows all kinds of fraud and crime and violence to be normalized by white people in society. And I'm seeing a couple other comments come in. Thank you so much, Simon. Yes, the ways in which we've internalized this, absolutely. Yeah. And the fact that, so thank you for sharing this, Alex, as well, that violence is happening to South Asian children, students as well. And how many times does that ever make the news? The amount of times that I hear about examples of Islamophobia, examples of, just anti-Asian racism that don't even make it to the news, that it, again, is part of this invisibilizing of our experience. I think as well about this idea of whiteness, which is different from white supremacy. Whiteness is a way of thinking. It's the assumptions, the beliefs, the practices that are in place that place the interests and the perspectives of white people at the center of what is considered normal and everyday. Now, this is a mouthful, but what this means is anytime we have a predetermined understanding of what something is, whether that is child welfare, whether that is leadership, whether that is solidarity, whether that is, whenever there's a predetermined understanding of what this is, that understanding is often, most often, meets the interests and the perspectives of white people. And so it becomes part of our everyday normal activity and understanding. And what we need to do, as scholars like Zeus Leonardo talk about, is Zeus says we need to make whiteness familiar and then strange. And what he's suggesting is that we are all swimming in this idea of what it means to live well, to be, to learn. We're swimming in these ideas that are determined by the interests and perspectives of white people. So we need to make it familiar. We need to understand it. We need to hold it at a distance and look at it and understand it and say, are these really values and assumptions and beliefs that I want to hold? How do I look at it with distance and then make it strange in the sense that it's one of many perspectives? It's not the default perspective. So I get to actually choose into other perspectives and not be dominated by this idea, not be saturated in this idea of whiteness, right? People often say that we are swimming in whiteness because we can't see it. When you're swimming in the waters, you can't really see it until you step outside and you look at the water separately, right? Another important concept here is this idea of racialization. Now, racialization is a political process, excuse me, and it's the process of ascribing ethnic or racial identities to a relationship, a social practice, or a group that did not identify itself as such. And so when we are racialized as South Asians, there's a whole bunch of meaning that is attached to that, about who we are, about model minorities, about keeping our heads down. There's a whole bunch of meaning that's attached to the ways in which we are racialized. And we are racialized by white society, right? So again, a difference between white people and white supremacy, right? So sometimes we racialize ourselves this way, but it's this complex and contradictory process through which groups that have less power come to be designated as part of a particular race, and on that basis subjected to differential or unequal treatment. So this is a structural and political mechanism, and it's intended to maintain power imbalances. It's intended to be invisible. We just learn these things about ourselves. We engage in these ways. You know, we are taught these things about ourselves, but it becomes invisible because we don't know that we can question it. And it's also connected to this notion of racial capitalism. And so while white people are also racialized, and they may not know that, but while they're also racialized, and the ways in which they're racialized often allows them to be innocent and pure and good and benevolent saviors, right? They are racialized in a particular way. What often happens is that because of everybody sort of, if you have sort of this racial hierarchy with white folks at the top, everybody underneath that is racialized according to the perceived value, economic and social value that we are assigned based on our racial identity. And so as South Asians being sort of in the middle of this racial hierarchy, we are assumed to have greater social and economic value in this hierarchy. And because we can produce more money, because we can, and again, I'm putting all this in quotations in case you can't see it, because we can quote unquote produce more money or have more social cohesion, it creates this sort of place where we are in this hierarchy. And therefore we have more value because we can bring in more capital, or the assumption is that we can bring in more capital. But all of these ideas are in relation. We cannot understand whiteness that is not in relation to anti-Blackness. Whiteness exists because anti-Blackness exists. So whiteness, this idea that, white folks are pure and innocent and, benevolent and good, needs an opposite. it needs to create this opposite of Blackness, which is deviant and criminal and, defiant and less than. So in order for whiteness to exist as the good, as the moral, as the pure, it needs a bad, an immoral, an impure. So these ideas are in relation. There's no such thing as whiteness without Blackness. Whiteness and settler logics also exist in relation to anti-indigeneity. And so you need to have the civilized white settler. In order for the civilized white settler to exist, you need an indigenous, uncivilized person. They need each other to exist. Model minorities, quote unquote, model minorities are in relation to whiteness and Blackness. So we are positioned in such a way, we were racially constructed in such a way that's in relation to whiteness and Blackness. In relation, and we'll talk more about this in a moment, but we need both of these polar opposite ends to exist in the middle. And of course, all of these systems of oppression, including casteism or caste oppression, are needed to sustain each other. Right? Wonderful. I'm seeing all these comments come in. So let's take a deeper look at this idea of troubling the model minority. So if we're looking at the model minority, this raises a number of issues. So first of all, we often hear the term BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, people of color. And I don't like that term because I think it essentially means anyone who's not white, which is the global majority. And it's, in my opinion, quite ridiculous to lump all those experiences together when we're talking about billions of people. And even the term POC, person of color, right? That lumps together East Asians, Southeast Asians, South Asians, Latinx, Middle Eastern, so many groups of people, again, billions of people into this category called POC. And these groups have and continue to experience multiple racisms, as was shared in the chat. We are often invisible in the media, in textbooks, in institutions. We are invisible often to each other. You have this mass array of billions of people around the world, the global majority, that are essentialized and reduced to POC. And we are essentially invisible POCs. But there's this hypervisibility and invisibility that happens. So the hypervisibility is that there's often this racist objectification. When you see a South Asian person on TV, it's often with an accent. It's often with they're doctors. It's often that they are side roles, that they're not the main role. We're only now starting to see the infusion of more and more central roles that are very complex experiences of people and that are not reduced to what the sort of comical way that white society has portrayed brown people or South Asian people in the media, or this exotification, these exotic people with this exotic food and clothes and these religious practices, and we want to just, it's so magical, like the magical South Asian. We're now starting, that's how we've been hyper-visibilized, that we've only been presented that way. But the experiences of brownness are often characterized also by invisibility, right? And ambiguity. And what that means is that we have all kinds of experiences and contradictions and contexts that never get named, that never get explored, whether in media or whether through texts for young children. I'm a former classroom teacher, so I think about how few books there were for young children that speak about the various kinds of languages and practices and values and experiences of young South Asian children, right? So there's the simultaneous invisibilizing that happens. There's also these tremendous complexities within and between our communities. It's important to ensure that we are not, the challenge with essentializing even the South Asian experience means that we're not naming the ways in which our intersections and histories and complexities create tensions between us. This notion of South Asian is actually a colonial and racist construct that was crudely and inconsistently used to group individuals together from the Caribbean, from Sri Lanka, from Afghanistan, from Bangladesh, from Nepal, India, Bhutan, Pakistan, the Maldives, and more. And grouped together, even though there are so many challenges and connections, both challenges and connections between those groups. Southasians captures this very complicated experiences, right, of colonization, of indentureship, of migrancy, of diaspora, of genocide, of revolutions, of those requiring refuge, right? It's a very complicated term. And despite our shared experiences of both oppression and resistance, Brown or South Asian communities comprise a plurality of experiences. And individuals have very different experiences based on affiliations with other communities, right? Based on movements transnationally, based on religion, based on caste, based on gender and sexuality, but based on social class, based on disability, language, accent, and more. All of this that makes up the Brown or South Asian experience. There's also this challenge that we straddle the black and white binary, this idea that the binary often does not account for the realities of people of color, right? So when we talk about anti-racism, it's black versus white, but what about folks in the middle who are invisibilized, who also are thinking about ethnicity and immigration status and language and accent, all of these things that don't get named when racism is understood as simply black and white. And of course, we're often straddling this idea of the model minority, which is held up in this way of, you know, and we'll talk more about this in a moment, but the perfect minority, and how that flips to the perpetual foreigner. And we saw this happening with East Asian folks during COVID, where East Asian folks for a long time have been thought of as the model minority in the last many years. And because of COVID, wanting to create this other, wanting to find fault in who started this massive, you know, global outbreak of COVID, all of a sudden, East Asians become the perpetual foreigner, the yellow peril, the dirty other, right? So it so quickly can flip back and forth depending on how we're needed in that moment. So, you know, this notion of the model minority was built on purpose. And so similar to immigration policies in the US, Canadian immigration policies gave birth to the model minority myth. And so while Canada's history of Brown South Asian migration over the last 50, 60 years includes tens of thousands of political refugees from countries such as Uganda, Guyana, Sri Lanka, and more, many Brown people also migrated to Canada based on the point system. So the Canadian Immigration Act in 1967 was intended to eliminate racial discrimination as an aspect of immigration policy. That was the supposed intent. What ended up happening was they focused on economic and population growth that limited immigration to skilled immigrants. And this impacted the type of folks that were able, the type of Brown folks and other folks that were able to come to Canada. So they were assigned points based on language fluency in English or French, their education and training, prearranged employment in Canada. Like these were all sorts of the ways in which only particular groups could come here, and fewer through refugee status. And so what that ends up doing is that while previously South Asians were in many ways not allowed into Canada. I think about the Kamagata Maru and other examples, and other East Asians and Southeast Asians were not allowed into Canada. We were the foreigners. This political construction during the time of the Immigration Act changed the racialization. And so as Vijay Prashad, who wrote the book, The Karma of Brown Folks, he says, the model minority myth emerged as a political identity in Canada and the US in the 60s and 70s during the rise of the civil rights movement to construct Asians as the answer to racial and economic challenges and the model race, the deserving other, thereby justifying the ongoing racism towards Black, Indigenous, and Latinx people. So we were constructed as the answer to a problem, that if we could be held up as these model minorities, as these wonderful people, as you know, these people who just keep their head down, they work really hard, they don't speak out against racism, they don't even experience racism. That's what white supremacy wants of us, right? To erase all those experiences. If it can do that, then it can justify, well, if Black communities and Indigenous communities aren't doing well, it's not because of us white people, it's because of them. There's something wrong with their culture. So we were racialized in a particular way to be able to be the solution to a much larger problem, or the perceived solution to a much larger problem. And we are also intentionally made invisible, right? The model minority myth erases, again, vast differences between our communities, and it positions all of us as perseverant, as industrious, as successful, as wealthy. Again, people who don't challenge racist systems, who are compliant with white society and the law. And this myth fails to account for not just the differences in experiences and not just the tensions that we have, but also all of the ways in which we have resisted this, all of the acts of solidarity that have existed, all of the ways in which various brown folks, brown communities have stood up against racism. It erases all of that. And so I'm just gonna, we won't have, feel free to sort of type this in the chat, folks, but just looking at time as well, I will just sort of move through this, but invite you to think about what are some of the ethno-racial experiences, that South Asian students, their families and communities have in the part of the world that you are in. So I know that many of you, again, are calling in from Ontario, but some of you may not. And so just thinking about what are some of the ethno-racial experiences and what are some of the complexities within and between Brown experiences. And feel free to type that in the chat as I move forward to the next slide. And just seeing the chat comments as well. Yeah. Yeah. Thank you all for sharing. Great comments here. So let's think about this. How do we theorize this? How do we make sense of this? And the first, I think that's really important, is to acknowledge the ways in which white supremacy operates in, or anti-Blackness in particular, operates in our communities, right? So it operates in many ways, from whom we can be friends with, to who we're allowed to date and marry. And whether this is implicitly or explicitly stated, it is very clear in many South Asian communities that you are not to date or marry a Black person. And that says something about our value. It's less explicitly stated or sometimes encouraged to marry a white person, right? And so what does that tell us about how we value people based on a hierarchy? It exists in our decisions as to where we choose to live, right? Oftentimes white neighborhoods are deemed good neighborhoods that are safe, that are respectful places, and Black neighborhoods are deemed bad neighborhoods that you don't want to go to because they're out of control and dangerous. Instead of looking at the larger social structures that are in place that underfund particular communities and move Black families and Black people into those communities on purpose as a structural move to sort of move them away from white folks, essentially, right? It operates in shadeism or colorism. And we look at casteism, for example, or Brahmanism and its connections to shadeism, right? Those that are seen as darker skin are often seen as impure, as deviant, or something wrong with them. Those that are seen as lighter skin are deemed, more pure. It's a social marker of affluence and beauty, where darker skin is seen as impoverished and ugly. And so these labels, which are so connected to class and caste, can easily be mapped on to anti-Black racism, because what we're doing is we are associating Blackness with impoverishment, with ugliness, with less worth, right? And we are associating lightness or whiteness with beauty, with affluence, with more worth. And that's something we have to really think about in our context. Think about Fair and Lovely and the $1 billion that company has made and many other skin lightening products. It's $1 billion industry because people are trying to look more white. People are trying to be more white because of the meaning that has in so many South Asian communities. And that meaning is rooted in anti-Blackness. There have been movements within the subcontinent to disrupt this, absolutely. And when brown people come to Canada as settlers, the ideas of casteism, shadeism, all these things come with them, come with us. And so anti-Blackness also exists in the way that we justify incomprehensible state-sanctioned violence against Black people as inevitable. blaming it on Black, quote unquote, Black culture, that it's a culture of criminality, saying what's wrong with them? Why can't they just follow the rules? And that's why the police and other authorities respond with violence, because these Black communities can't follow the rules. Now, that's nonsense. We have seen time and again that built into the structure of policing is anti-Blackness. And so to ask Black people to follow the rules in a system that's designed to kill them is the most dehumanizing thing we can ask. And yet you hear this rhetoric in so many South Asian communities that it's the fault of Black communities. It's because they're criminals. It's because of their culture that the police are responding to them in this way. Instead of turning the gaze upward and saying, how is the structure actually enabling this kind of violence towards Black communities? And brown communities that are darker skinned. So when we look at the experiences of perhaps West Indian children or Tamil children that have darker skin, that are quote unquote blackened, where a white police officer may not know the difference, we see higher levels of violence from police towards those communities than we do lighter skinned South Asians. Right? Now that says something, that there's this continuum of how this happens. And we have to be aware of challenging the system and the structure that associates criminality with darker skin, because it impacts all of us, and it's just completely inhumane. Anti-Black racism also perpetuates is in comments that we make about our presence, and making comments that associate, again, Blackness with any kind of deviance or criminality or hypersexuality or aggression or being uncivilized or being too loud or being ignorant or unintelligent. It also operates when we reduce a very complex Black identities to simply food, sports, music, and crime, right? When this and in the same way that we as brown folks get reduced to Bollywood and, maybe Hindi or Malayali or a particular language and samosas, like the way that we get reduced, this entirely complex experience gets reduced to this food or this sport or this music or cricket, right? Like how do we not do that to other groups, especially knowing what it feels like when it's done to us? It's when brown people, and we see this happening more and more in schools with children, using the N-word very freely and not understanding the gravity of and the history and the discourse and the trauma that word activates for so many people. And the reality is that many brown people have reaped personal and financial benefits through the appropriation of Black culture, including hip hop music, Black clothing, Black language. And this is not solidarity. This is a money-making capitalistic approach, using Black culture and appropriating Black culture to seem, more with it, more cool, however you want to sort of think about it. But these are the many ways in which anti-Blackness operates in our communities. And again, I encourage you to continue to share all of these pieces. Simon, thank you so much for what you just named here. This concept of police brutality towards Dalits, Adivasis, tribals, it is the exact same rhetoric. It's the exact same thinking. And folks like Maya Bardwaj and Danmori Sundararajan, who are Dalit, Danmori is a Dalit scholar, Chinaya Jungam here in Canada, these folks are talking about this criminalization of the other is the exact same thinking of the treatment of Dalits in India as it is of Black people here. The same thinking. So it's that thinking and that structure that we need to attack in both places, not just here with regards to anti-Black racism, but also closer to home, which is oftentimes harder. I think about this, what does this mean? How do we make sense of this? And, Eduardo Bonilla Silva talked about many years ago this idea that there's actually three groups. There's the whites, there's the collective Black, and there's the honorary whites. Now, the collective Black is not just Black folks. It could be other people who identify with Black consciousness, who want to challenge the systems and structures that have maintained racial hierarchy. So many Latinx people might fit within there. Many South Asians might fit within there. But this honorary white category is where so many South Asians fit. And this is a group that is can go either way. And Vinay Harpalani, who is a critical race theorist, said that it's framed by this idea of racial ambiguity. So in terms of our phenotype, there are many of us that can look more white. There are many of us that can look more black. So we sort of span this spectrum. So we're ambiguous. Many times people don't know if somebody who's South Asian is actually maybe Latinx or is actually white. But also politically we can go in both directions too. So here's where you have people that are aligning with collective Black consciousness, trying to change the system. And you have people that are aligning with whiteness and white supremacy because they're trying to move ahead in a system that doesn't really want them anyway. And so how do we think about this? How do we make sense of this? What it means to be in the middle is that we have both racial ascriptions placed on us. Now, an ascription is like a racist stereotype almost that's placed on us. But we also have racial claims. We're also claiming racial status in different ways. So what this means is that a racial ascription could be something like labels of being a foreigner or being mysterious or being exotic or being a terrorist. Right, and there's many Hindus, sort of caste and class privileged Hindus that have distanced themselves from Muslims post 9/11 because they don't want to be called terrorists, right? And so it's this distancing from Muslimness, it's this or Islam, it's this distancing from Black communities because we don't want to be connected to them, because if we are, we might be harmed as well. Instead of saying, how do we all come together and challenge us collectively, there is a distancing that often happens. But another harmful label is the model minority. So while these racial ascriptions, these sort of stereotypes that are placed on us are not by choice, racial claims are by choice. And so these racial claims are to increase our racial status, which often correlates with increases in wealth, with moving up the ladder, with social capital, with symbolic capital, with political protection, right? And so Deepa Iyer, who's a South Asian activist, she says that, many South Asians take the racial bribe and climb the racial ladder in a futile attempt to reach the status of whiteness. And so racial claims can serve to intentionally distinguish or distance us from lower caste and lower class South Asians, and from Black folks, and from South Asians that have been othered through religion. So Muslims in particular. So, for example, what this might look like is that some South Asians embrace the model minority stereotype and they use it to their own perceived advantage, even though it's so damaging to our collective, because they want to get ahead. They want more money. They want more notoriety. They want more protection, right? And so it operates in these very different ways. I also think about the work of Vidya Prashad, who said, when he said, how does it feel when W.E.B. Du Bois, back in the 1800s, wrote a book called The Souls of Black Folks, he asked the question, how does it feel to be a problem? And he asked the question based on the color line that existed in the 20th century in the US. A century later, Vijay Prashad asks the question, sorry, not a century later, 40 years later, Vijay Prashad asks the question, what does it feel like to be the solution? How does it feel to be the solution? And so here we are looking at the relationality, right? While whiteness constructs its meaning as normal and natural and superior in relation to Blackness, which is deviant and different and inferior, brownness constructs its meaning in relation to both. So it helps us to think about, I encourage you to ask yourself these questions, both individually and collectively. How might we make sense of the model minority groups that are both harmed by whiteness and aspire to whiteness? It's a very complex location to be in, where we are harmed by the very system that we are aspiring to. It makes me think of, sometimes when you see a group of children, there's like a bully at the top, and then there's the person that's right underneath the bully, that even though the bully is treating them badly, they are trying so hard to gain the acceptance of that bully, for protection, for acceptance, for whatever it might be. That is the collective position of the model minority. where we are aspiring to the top, even though that top is always going to come down and hurt us. And we need to expose how futile that attempt is, especially for young people. And how might we acknowledge the harm that we experience and the invisibility and the erasure that we experience, and simultaneously acknowledge that the harm that we enact in anti-Blackness in our communities, right? Without understanding how we have been purposely pegged in this racial hierarchy, we are enacting violence on Black communities and other communities. How do we make sense of that, right? In part, this means that we need to make visible what has intentionally been made invisible. In part, this means that we need to say to ourselves and to each other, these are the experiences of racism we have had. White supremacy wants us to keep those experiences of racism hidden. If we talk about the fact that we've experienced racism, how could we possibly be the model? How could we possibly be held up as the model, as the solution, as the deserving minority, if we're experiencing all these challenges? So we need to make invisible the experiences that we have had. We need to think about what that means to speak to young people about this, to talk about racism, to talk about racism in a larger context. So we need to focus our attention there. And we need to understand this in the context of a continuum, right? Now, the concept of a racial continuum really helps us to support solidarity efforts, because it helps us understand that we were positioned in the middle on purpose, with Black communities as the ultimate other and Indigenous communities as the ultimate other. And it helps us recognize that we can't actually disrupt racism towards our communities, towards South Asians, if we're not thinking about it in the larger context of anti-Blackness. It doesn't actually make sense to say, we're going to focus on anti-Asian racism if we're not going to understand how anti-Asian racism is related to anti-Black racism. There would be no anti-Asian racism if there was no anti-Black racism. That is where we need to focus our energy collectively, at the root of the problem. If we're only focused on the way that we experience racism and talk about that and heal from that, which is important, but if we don't understand it in a larger context, we are forever going to be experiencing racism as South Asians. And our Black colleagues and friends and neighbors and coworkers will also forever be experiencing racism, even worse. So it doesn't actually make sense for us to only tackle the middle. We have to look at it in a larger context. This also means that we have to think about it in the sense that, and this is something that I share with when I'm speaking largely to Black educators or communities, is allow South Asian communities and Brown communities to talk about the racism that they've experienced. If we continue to shut it down, we cannot build the racial consciousness of Brown communities. We will forever be stunted as Brown communities because we haven't yet raised our own racial consciousness. And we do that by first naming the ways in which we've experienced it and then putting that into some larger context. Right? Brown acceptance in white colonial spaces has always been conditional. We are pawns in a system designed to justify in law and in every institution deep-seated historical and state-sanctioned violence towards Black and Indigenous people through the continual erasure and invisibility of our experiences of racism. We are designed as a racial category to justify anti-Black racism. And that is a very hard thing for us to sit with, for us to explore, for us to be with. I'm conscious of the time here and just drawing to a close. So if there are questions that are coming up, please feel free to think about them and write them in the chat, and we'll get to them in just a moment. I want to share as well here that in a system of white supremacy, it's actually quite dangerous for racialized groups to be in solidarity because it challenges white supremacy in ways that it can't contain itself anymore. It's dangerous for groups to learn about histories of solidarities. It's dangerous to dare to forge future solidarities. And I think about the importance of teaching young people about the efforts that have existed to divide Black and Brown communities. and the fact that these communities have still found ways to be in solidarity, that capitalism and white supremacy in particular have intentionally through immigration acts, through a number of different things have found ways to pit us against each other, because you can't sustain this system if we are fighting against each other. That's what it needs. It needs us to turn on each other so that we don't turn our gaze upward. But it also makes me think about, the fact that these solidarities are not easy. Nishant Upadhyay talks about uneasy solidarities. And what he says is that we need to acknowledge the power asymmetries that exist within Brown communities, between Brown and Black communities, in relation to casteism and settler colonial, all of these different interconnections, that it makes it uneasy, but it makes it a necessary and worthwhile effort. I think about histories of solidarities between the Black Panthers and the Dalit Panthers. I think about Brown folks that have marched and supported Black liberation movements in the 60s and 70s in the US and in apartheid South Africa. I think about solidarities between enslaved Africans and Indian indentured servants in the Caribbean. And of course, the beautiful relationships that have existed between civil rights activists like W.E.B. Du Bois and folks like Nehru and Tagore and Ambedkar and Lala Lajpat Rai. So many histories of solidarity. And today, South Asian Awareness Network, South Asian for Black Lives, Asians for Black Lives, so many groups that are wanting to dismantle this very notion that we are going to be kept separate and divided on purpose, and instead look for ways to challenge that and be in solidarity with one another. And finally, this idea that we need to take bold action. What white supremacy wants us to do is to stay in silence, to not act, to be fearful, to deny that there's even a problem. But what we need to do is name the problem. We need to name experiences of oppression. We need to take action. And we need to take action, especially around the structures in child welfare that perpetuate this overrepresentation of Black and Indigenous children in care. We need to take action as South Asians, understanding that these mechanisms are inhumane and are affecting us all. It's looking for the interconnections, but it's also just looking at the inhumaneness of those practices and structures that deem Indigenous and Black families as incapable of caring for their own children, as though there's only one way to care, as though there's only one arbitrator of what that means and looks like. We have to break those patterns, and we have to act collectively with Black and Indigenous communities to break those patterns. I'm thinking about what this means for young people and families and staff, and thinking about a two-pronged approach here. One is this idea that we are making visible our racial consciousness, that we are taking time to share experiences, to heal, to talk about the differences between our communities, the ways in which power exists between and within our communities, challenging notions of shadism, challenging notions of, those who come from India are somehow more South Asian than others, challenging notions of Islamophobia and Sikhphobia and Brahmanism and casteism and all these other forms of oppression, heteropatriarchy that operate in our communities, making visible these experiences, talking about them, again, sharing them, healing from them in community. But we cannot do that without understanding ourselves as part of a larger racial continuum. We have to understand the fact that we have been racialized, even though all these complexities exist, we have been racialized in the middle on purpose, that we have been pegged there on purpose to uphold the mistreatment of Black and Indigenous communities. And we cannot be okay with that, because it harms us, it harms Black and Indigenous communities, and it upholds the needs and interests of white society and intersections of capitalism. So we need to understand our racialization in context, in relation, understand why we have been racialized this way, and actively challenge ourselves to push against these narratives that if we just work really hard, we can make it. And you see, I'm sure all of you are on these WhatsApp chats where my parents send me these things all the time, or family members of this Indian person that made it, and all these, the top CEOs of all these companies are all Indian. All of that is aspirational whiteness. All of that, all of the pride that we take in our people, quote unquote, making it to the top, that is aspirational whiteness. When do we ever celebrate our people who are on the streets marching for a Black Lives Matters protest, or who are working strategically and subversively and collectively with Black communities to change policies and practices that are harming? When do we celebrate that? Let's change the focus of what we choose to hold up as prideful examples of South Asians, and instead turn our attention to South Asians that are transforming systems that have for far too long harmed far too many people. So I will pause there, folks, for questions and answers, and see where we come from here. Siju, I'll just turn it over to you to see if you wanted to navigate this part, and I'll stop sharing here.
Thank you, Dr. Shah, for really powerful and thought-provoking ideas, sharing those ideas and information. Now we have a few minutes if anyone from the participants, if anyone has any particular questions, we can ask, we can directly put it on the chat box. Now, while others think about their own questions, something I have always find it difficult in an organization really is that I think, the term that was very loud and clear that stuck to me from today's discussion is solidarity. But I think that what the difficulty for people to move forward with that is, there is a certain level of competition I see in organizations. And people find, I think earlier, many people expressed that in the chat box also, that there is a feeling of left out. We are not visible anymore. No one is talking about us. It's, slogans like, everyone's life matters, not just, Black life matters. So how do we navigate? Because, we talked about in between, that whiteness aspiration, that's not just among brown, and it's among every minority communities. So the leadership, using that racial capitalism, and then who comes up in the leadership, there is also a feeling like, once oppressed become oppressors. But then, they can still use the racial capitalism to continue to go up. So where does this social location comes in? Because, someone who is in the top, just because of their color of skin, if they are in the top, someone who is a light skin or a white person who is much more deprived than that person. So where is this social location plays a role in this?
So that's such an important question, Suji, because I think, it challenges the fundamental racism of meritocracy. To me, meritocracy is a myth. This idea that we all just work really hard, that we can all sort of make it, is a myth. Because what it leaves out is the number of white people who have gotten jobs for centuries because of the color of their skin. That is a form of affirmative action that we don't call affirmative action, right? So many white people, because of the connections that they have, because of the networks that they have, because of assumed intelligence that they have. There's this term called white mediocrity, which means that, you could just be a mediocre person doing work, and because you have white skin, you are promoted. All of these are forms of racism that we have normalized. We just assume that when a white person gets a job, they get the job because they deserve the job. And there's an assumption that when a Black person gets a job, they get the job because we need a Black person in that role. And instead, what we need to do is fundamentally shift that and say to ourselves, in what ways does having lived experience count as a form of expertise that we need to hold up as a fundamental criteria for hiring. And not just lived experience, but also expertise in that area. You know, I think about in the work that I do with leaders and school boards, and so many of the Black leaders and school boards are doctors. They have PhDs. So many of the white counterparts do not. But the Black folks know that in order to have an equal seat at the table, they have to do this entire extra degree just to have the assumption that they have the right to be there. And even with that degree are treated as less than. And so I think what this does is it calls to question the fundamental racist nature and ableist nature of meritocracy. It is no, and I say this often to students in my class as well, you know, that I am in front of you speaking to you as a professor, but I might not be the best person to be here right now. There is somebody who's doing this work in community on the streets who didn't have access to getting a higher degree education that is probably better suited to talk to you about this than I am. And I say to the students as well, all of you had to put in applications to get into this program. But how many of you knew somebody who was a teacher that could help write your statement of intent? How many of you knew somebody who could be your reference? How many of you knew the language to put in your statement of intent, because that is what the criteria is, because you have people around you that know this process? This is the fundamental challenge with ideas of meritocracy. And I think, you know, we as South Asians in this moment right now need to understand that we have to give some space for the fact that this movement towards Black lives, this presencing of Black life and intelligence and brilliance and genius and joy is coming up against hundreds of years of the aftermath of enslavement, hundreds of years of internalized oppression, of continued policies and institutions. I mean, so many of us as South Asians look to the police as a site of safety. That is not the case for many of our Black friends and community members. The police is a site of lack of safety, of terror. The fact that we can often go into a hospital and there's likely going to be a South Asian doctor there, possibly even speaking a language that we understand, says something about access, says something about the kind of care that we're going to receive. The fact that we are seen as these sort of hardworking, model, successful, professional people means that we are treated in society in a way that many of our Black colleagues and friends are not. And so in this moment about what about us, the what about us isms, you know, what that does is it erases the differences between our communities. We are not all experiencing racism the same way. We are not all racialized the same way. And without that understanding of history and present day context, of course, we're going to say, what about us? But when we start to really understand the fundamental differences in how we experience life in the bodies that we are in, then there's some grace and some space that's given. And so, yes, we do need to be talking about our own harm and racism. And let's do that in our communities first, like this. Let's heal together first and talk about what solidarity could look like first, without imposing that in our places of work.
Thank you, Dr. Shah.
Me too, Ellen. Racial consciousness, yeah. I see a question here from Simon. Suju, do you want me to answer that one? Can we view the Freedom Convoy as an angry response to the growing solidarity between racialized Indigenous? You know, I think that, yes, here's a quick answer, yes. I think that, you know, the US had its version through not just Donald Trump, but the entire system that made Donald Trump possible. And, you know, here in Canada, we have Pierre Poilievre and others who are spewing very similar rhetorics. This is an example of how, no matter how much we quote unquote make it in white society, we are always outsiders. The Freedom Convoy is the perfect example. They literally shut down the entire city for weeks. And if that were Black and Indigenous communities protesting, they would have been out a long time ago. And so I think in many ways, this hope or maybe naivete that we have, that if we just work really hard and don't really speak out too much, that we can make it and be safe is a farce. We're seeing such a growing right-wing, alt-right, emboldened group in Canada and the US. And we cannot escape that. We cannot escape that. So the question is, how are we going to choose to align our politics? Are we going to choose to align our politics with a Black radical racial consciousness, or are we going to choose to align our politics with white supremacy and uphold white supremacy? It is, and there's probably variations of that in the middle, but I think that there has to be an intentional choice that we make as to where are we going to turn our attention.
Can I have one question?
Please go ahead, Biju.
Go ahead, Baiju.
Oh, thank you. My name is Baijam. I'm speaking from Edmonton, Alberta, where the whole question of racism, discrimination, immigration is much different from the way you see it in Eastern Canada. And thank you very much, Vidya, for your very meaningful reflections on the topic. I was very much interested and fascinated by one of the discussion points where we say, like, all those successful Asian immigrants are kind of seen as a kind of example of successful immigration. On the other side, the reality of the discrimination and racism that we experience everyday life is a much, much different context. Like recently, there was a report on how the second generation Asian immigrants are thriving very much in educational attainments throughout Canada. In the US also, there is a kind of a saying that, Indian immigrants actually are perhaps the second largest, richest community in the US. So even though that notion is there as a kind of successful immigrants, and of course, there are several factors that we can find leading to such a kind of assumption. But there is also the other reality of how oppressed we are, or rather how not privileged we are in comparison to the white settlers. Yeah, I mean, I was wondering if you can just a bit more explain on that construction of that successful Asian immigrant identity and how it is seen in the whole racial discrimination and Canadian context.
Mm-hmm. That's such a great question. And thank you so much for that question, because what it does is it also invites us to not lump all South Asians into the successful Asian category piece, right? There's so many examples of, again, caste oppressed, class oppressed, working class South Asians that are aligning with Black communities, with Indigenous communities, because they actually feel a greater sense of belonging and solidarity there than they do with upper class and caste Indians. And so this is, or South Asians. And so this is a really interesting piece. And it does speak to the fact that there are so many differences in how we experience this. And so you might have, what is happening now is we're holding up quote unquote successful examples of folks that, because of class and caste privilege, have access to things that many other people don't have. And this gets held up as a sign of success that everybody else should aspire to. And so it erases all of the different ways in which South Asians come to these lands and experience these lands. But I think what we want to do is also challenge this idea of what we choose to take pride in. Making it to the top in a capitalist white supremacist system means that we are upholding capitalism and white supremacy at its core. And so to be successful in that system, what does that actually mean? To be successful in a system that is based on hierarchy, that is based on the dispossession of people and lands, that's based on literally having to close our eyes to all kinds of injustice to quote unquote make it in that system. that is not something that we need to be holding up in any community as a sign of pride. And it's not that we don't want people leading these big companies. It's not that, Twitter or, all these companies that have sort of South Asian leaders are doing, well, there's a whole different conversation about Twitter right now, but it's not that they're doing these horrible, terrible things, but it's built on systems of capitalism and white supremacy and settler colonialism that if we don't understand what it is upholding, then we're going to continue. All we're doing is saying we value people that can make it to the top of a really unfortunate, inhumane system. That is not something we should be proud of. That is something that needs to be put in context. That is something that we need to say, okay, you're here. We're going to hold you to account. What are you doing to challenge hate crime on Twitter? What are you doing to, we have to hold them to a different level of account and not hold them up as these sort of prized possessions in our communities. Let me just ask you, Benjamin, I'd love to hear how you're hearing what I just said, and if you had any further thoughts or questions.
No, I get it. I got it what you said, and I was actually thinking about the same, and all those notions that we try to follow, as you said, exactly said, like the white supremacist capitalistic pattern, and very interestingly, that notion totally neglects and disregard the Oriental perspectives or the perspective that is coming from global South, including Asia or Africa, those concepts. So we have to actually give ourselves to that competition of that very hierarchical capitalistic supremacist notions and forsaking whatever community-based context that we people, immigrants come from.
Yes.
So that is also another point to add to that one. Yeah, you are absolutely right. Thank you.
But I just want to echo what you just said as well, Benjamin, this idea that when we survive in this system that's so hierarchical, we end up erasing exactly what you just said, community-based knowledge, our own ancestral knowledges, other ways of thinking and being in the world. All of that gets erased because we're aligning to a system that was developed by and upheld and maintained by white supremacy. And so here's where I often think about the importance of, as China rises in power, as India rises in power, we need to be holding our people and our communities to a heightened level of scrutiny because of that power. In the same way that America has been held to a heightened level of scrutiny in Britain worldwide, we need to hold our own communities to that heightened level of scrutiny because we are gaining in economic and political power globally. And a lot of us don't want to talk about that. A lot of us don't want to think about that. A lot of us don't want to talk about Hindutva and all these other movements that are really harming so many people. That's where we need to turn our attention as well, is how are we aligning with, like I think about the relationships between Modi and Trump and the Israeli prime minister, like we need to start having really important discussions about how we are upholding these forms of oppression in our own communities. And it's growing. Thank you so much, Benjamin. I appreciate that.
I know this is such an interesting topic that we need more time actually to continue with the discussion, but this is just a beginning. We are not ending this session here, and this is something that is having an impact on our day-to-day life. We all experience this. We all need to go through this, and it is an important topic that we need to continue with this discussion. So again, once again, thank you Maswo for organizing this. And then, as Alan mentioned here in the chat, if people have further questions or anyone wants to continue with the discussions, please use Maswo's emails, and then we can, as a small group, we can still continue with these discussions. I'm mindful of time, so it's 12:05. So over to you, Alan.
Yeah, thank you, sir. Thank you, Simon. I will invite my colleague Arun to say a few words and wrap up. Arun, over to you, Arun.
Hi, all. Hope you had a great session. On behalf of Massive Executive, I am glad to express my word of thanks. Special thanks to our chief guest and speaker, Ms. Vidya Shah, for accepting our invitation and for being with us today. Thank you for enlightening us with the concepts. You have created a big room for us to learn further. Also taking this opportunity to express our gratitude to Mr. C.J. Simon, who graciously moderated the session, and thank you for all the good questions you asked. And thank you, Anjana Joy, for associating with the session. Finally, thank you to all participants who managed to find time to join during a long, busy weekend. Thank you all and have a long weekend.
Can I have a few seconds? My name is Vidya.
Yes, Vidya, we will definitely